This video is for the lads who served on HMS Sheffield and some who are still on patrol today. On April 2nd, 1982, Argentina, under the control of a failing military junta, invaded the overseas territory of the Falkland Islands, as well as South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. The Argentinians believed that the British wouldn't care, and they thought they wouldn't retaliate or try to take back these islands. They, however, were very, very wrong. On April 5th, 1982, the British government, led by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, dispatched a task group to retake the islands. However, the Royal Navy had sent two nuclear submarines down to the Falklands, HMS Splendid and HMS Spartan. This would be the first wave. On the 6th of April, the War Cabinet was set up, and this would be met every day to discuss the political issues that would transpire whilst the conflict would take place. With eyes from all around the world looking at these small islands, Britain had to act quickly. They would buy all Exocet anti-ship missiles off the market, acquiring Sidewinder missiles from the US, as well as requesting the use of the USS Iwo Jima if they were to lose an aircraft carrier. There would have been a later report stating that the US Secretary of State Alexander Haig wanted Ronald Reagan to side with the Argentinians, which he luckily denied. Anyway, the British government had no contingency plan for an invasion of the islands, and the task force was rapidly put together from whatever vessels were available. The nuclear-powered submarine Conqueror had set sail from Faslane on the 4th of April, while the two aircraft carriers, Invincible and Hermes, in company with the escort vessels of the fleet, left Portsmouth only a day later. On return to Southampton from a world cruise on the 7th of April, the ocean liner SS Canberra was requisitioned and set sail 2 days later with 3 Commander Brigade on board. The ocean liner QE2 was also requisitioned and left Southampton on the 12th of May with 5 Infantry Brigade on board. The whole task force would eventually comprise of 127 ships, 43 Royal Navy vessels and 22 Royal Fleet Auxiliary vessels, as well as 62 merchant ships. The retaking of the Falklands was viewed as extremely difficult. The chances of the British counter-invasion succeeding was assessed by the US Navy, according to historian Arthur L. Herman, as a military impossibility. Firstly, the British would significantly be constrained by the disparity in deployed air cover. The British had 42 aircraft, 28 Sea Harriers and 14 Harrier GR3s, which were available for air combat operations, against approximately 122 serviceable jet fighters from Argentina's Air Force. This would comprise of 50, which were used for the air superiority role, and the remainder as strike aircraft. Crucially, the British lacked the airborne early warning and control aircraft. Now, planning was also considered the Argentine surface fleet and the threat posed by Exocet equipped vessels, or the two Type 209 submarines. By mid-April, the Royal Air Force had set up an airbase at RAF Ascension Island, co-located with Wide Awake Airfield on the mid-Atlantic British overseas territory of the Ascension Islands, including a sizable force of Avro Vulcan B Mark II bombers, Hadley Page Victor K Mark II refueling aircraft, and McDonnell Douglas Phantom FRG Mark II fighters. Meanwhile, the main naval force that Britain was bringing arrived at Ascension to prepare for active service. A small force had already been sent south to recapture South Georgia. Encounters began in April. The British task force was shadowed by the Boeing 707 aircraft of the Argentine Air Force during their travel to the south. Several of these flights were intercepted by Sea Harriers outside the British-imposed exclusion zone. The unarmed 707 did not attack because diplomatic moves were still in progress and the UK had not decided to commit itself to an armed force. On the 23rd of April, the Brazilian commercial Douglas DC-10 from Varig Airways en route to South Africa was intercepted by British Harriers, who visually identified it as a civilian aircraft. As mentioned before, the South Georgia force had landed on South Georgia, and these were under the command of Major Guy Sheridan Royal Marines, consisting of Marines from 42 Commando, a troop of the SAS and SBS, and these were intended to land a reconnaissance force for the invasion by the Royal Marines. All were embarked on RFA Tide Spring, not the new one, the old one. First to arrive was the Churchill-class submarine HMS Conqueror on the 19th of April, and the island was overflown by radar mapping Headley Page Victors on the 20th of April. The first landings of SAS troops took place on the 21st of April, but with the southern hemisphere's autumn setting in, the weather was so bad that their landings and the others made the next day were withdrawn after 2 helicopters crashed on a glacier. On the 23rd of April, a submarine alert was sounded and operations were halted when the tie spring was withdrawn to deeper waters to avoid interception. On the 24th of April, the British forces regrouped and headed into attack. On the 25th of April, after resupplying the Argentine garrison in South Georgia, the submarine ARA Santa Fe was spotted on service. If you want to understand what happened to that, I have a brief on it already. Now, with tie spring now far out to sea, the Argentine forces, augmented by the submariners, Major Sheridan decided to gather the 76 men he had and make a direct assault by day. After a short forced march by the British troops and naval bombardment demonstrations by Antrim and Plymouth, the Argentine forces surrendered without resistance. The message sent from the naval base at South Georgia to London was, "Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that the White Ensign flies alongside the Union Jack on South Georgia. God save the Queen." The Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, broke the news to the media, telling them to just rejoice at the news and congratulate our forces and the Marines. By the 1st of May, British operations on the Falklands opened with Black Buck 1, the longest bombing raid in history. This was basically designed to bombard the airfield at Stanley. This used a Vulcan bomber which flew from Ascension Islands on an 8,000 nautical mile round trip, dropping conventional bombs across the runway at Stanley and then back to Ascension. The mission required repeated refueling and required several Victor K2 tankers operating in concert, including tanker-to-tanker refueling. The overall effect on the raids of the war is difficult to determine, and the raids consumed precious tanker resources from Ascension, but also prevented Argentina from stationing fast jets on the islands. According to historian Lawrence Friedman, who was given access to official sources, comments that the significance of the Vulcan raid remains controversial. Although taking pressure off the small Sea Harrier force, the raid was costly and used a great deal of resources. The single hit in the centre of the runway was probably the best that could have been expected, but it did reduce the capability of the runway to operate fast jets and caused the Argentine Air Force to deploy Mirage 3s to defend the capital. Argentine sources confirm that the Vulcan raids influenced Argentina to withdraw some of its Mirage 3s from southern Argentina to the Buenos Aires defense zone. This dissuasive effect was watered down when British officials made it clear that there would not be strikes on air bases in Argentina. The raids were then later dismissed as propaganda by Falklands veteran Commander Nigel Ward. Of the 5 Black Buck raids, 3 were against Stanley Airfield, with the other 2 anti-radar missions using Shrike anti-radiation missiles. Around the same time, the 2 British naval task forces, one the surface and the other being the submarines, as well as the Argentine fleet, were operating in the neighbourhood of the Falkland Islands and will soon come into conflict. The first naval loss was the Second World War vintage Argentine light cruiser, the General Belgrano. The nuclear-powered submarine, HMS Conqueror, sank the Belgrano on the 2nd of May. 323 members of the General Belgrano's crew died in the incident. More than 700 were rescued from the open sea despite cold seas and stormy weather. The loss of the General Belgrano totaled nearly half the Argentine deaths of the Falklands War, and the loss of the ship hardened the stance of the Argentine government. If you want to learn more about the Belgrano and her sinking, there is a brief that I've literally just uploaded a couple of days before on the subject, so go take a look. Now, after all that backstory leading up to the escalation of the war, it's now time to tell you the story of the sinking of HMS Sheffield. In response to the Argentine invasion of the Falklands, Sheffield was ordered on the 2nd of April 1982 to join the task force being assembled to retake the island. Ammunition and supplies were taken on board in Gibraltar, while pictures were removed and loose fittings were stowed. While all of her carpets below one deck were taken up, they were left in place on deck 1 and above, which, when she was hit, would subsequently catch fire. To avoid her being mistaken for the Argentine Hercules and Satsuma Trinidad, a vertical black mark was painted on the funnel and down to the side of her waterline to aid in recognition. To Departing for the South Atlantic, she reached Ascension Isles on the 10th of April, sailing from there on the 14th in company with HMS Arrow, HMS Brilliant, Coventry, Glasgow, and later joined by RFA Apple Leaf. They joined the other vessels of Task Force 317 and commenced operations in the total exclusion zone around the Falklands on the 1st of May 1982. It was British policy that any Royal Navy vessel that's suspected to be under missile attack was to turn towards the threat, accelerate to maximum speed, and fire chaff to prevent the ship from being caught defenceless. The code word used to start this procedure was handbrake, which was to be broadcast once the signal that the Super E's Agave radar was picked up on ESM. On Task Force ships, including Sheffield, the threat of the Type 209 submarine was seen as a higher priority than the threat from the air. Following the sinking of the Belgrano, Captain Salt, the CO of the Sheffield, ordered that Sheffield would make a course change every 90 seconds to counter the Argentine submarine threat. Sheffield was first detected by an Argentine Naval Aviation Lockheed SP-2H Neptune patrol aircraft, who was keeping the British vessels under surveillance and verifying Sheffield's position again at 0814 and 0843. Two Superintendard, or Super E's for short to make life a little bit easier, took off from a Rio Grande airfield and rendezvoused with an Argentine Air Force KC-130H Hercules tanker at 1000 hours. The two aircraft were 3 Alpha 202 and 3 Alpha 203. Approximately 1000 hours, Sheffield was at Defence Watches, which is the second degree of readiness, MBCD State 2 Condition X-ray. All watertight doors are open. She was the most southernmost of the 3 Type 42 destroyers, the others being Glasgow and Coventry, operating as the forward anti-aircraft picket 18 to 30 miles to the west of the main task force, which was operating southeast of the Falklands. The weather was fair and the sea was calm, with a 2-metre swell. HMS Invincible, which was the main task force, was responsible for the Anti-Air Warfare Coordination, or AWC. Sheffield had relieved her sister ship Coventry, as the latter was having technical problems with her Type 965 radar. It is to note that prior to the attack, Sheffield operators had been experiencing difficulty distinguishing Mirage and Super E's, and the destroyer may have lacked effective IFF codes or radar jamming. Now, despite having been supplied with intelligence briefs that identified that the Exocet was possible by Super E's, which had been refueled in flight, Sheffield had assessed the Exocet threat to be overrated for the previous 2 days and assessed them to be another false alarm. The Neptune climbed to 3,840 feet and detected 2 medium-sized contacts at the coordinates of 5233.5 south, 5740.5 west. A few minutes later, the Neptune contacted the Super E's with this information. Flying at extremely low level, both Super E's climbed to 520 feet to verify these contacts, but failed to locate them and returned to low altitude. At 25 miles later, they climbed again, and after a few seconds of scanning, the targets appeared on their radar screens. Both pilots loaded the coordinates into their weapon systems, returned to low level, and after the last-minute checks, each launched a Exocet missile at 11:04, while 20 to 30 miles away from their targets. However, back in Sheffield, at the time of the attack, the captain was off duty in his cabin after having previously visited the ops room, while Sheffield's Anti-Air Warfare Officer, or AWO, was in the wardroom chatting to a steward, and his assistant was in the heads. As the Type 965 radar could not detect aircraft flying low, the 2 incoming enemy aircraft were not detected when they were flying at 30 meters. Instead, they were first detected at a distance of 40 nautical miles by the UAA-1 off Glasgow. 300, Agave, 300. Glasgow's ESM operator picks up the Agave radars at 300 relative to the ship's bow. Now, this was backed up by the Glasgow's 965M radar, and this basically pointed out the aircraft had gone to 37 metres above sea level, and the aircraft were 45 miles out. Glasgow instantly went to action stations.
Action stations. Assume NBCD state 1 Zulu.
Instantly should to transmit the code word handbrake via UHF and HF to all task force ships. The radar contacts were also seen in Invincible, which directed Sea Harriers on cap to investigate, but they detected nothing. The AUK on Invincible declared the radar contacts as false and left the air warning to yellow instead of raising it to red. In response to Glasgow's warning, an order to stand to had been issued to the crews of the 4.5 Sea Dart and 20mm guns. Sheffield picked up the incoming missiles on a 965 radar. The operations officer informed the missile director, who queried the contacts in ADOLS 4, and 10 seconds later, the aircraft were detected on the Forest 909 radar, but not the ART one, which had a clear view of the aircraft and missiles. Sheffield UAA-1 sensor was blocked by an unauthorized transmission on Scott. Now, no detection was reported via data link from Glasgow, and 7 seconds later, the first Exocet missile was fired, in response to which Glasgow fired its chaff. The suspected aircraft was not being detected as the officers on Sheffield had expected, and it was not until smoke was sighted from the bridge that it confirmed there was a sea-skimming missile heading their way. Mesmerised by the sight, the bridge crew didn't call the captain to the bridge, made no call to action stations, did not turn the ship towards the incoming missile to reduce the ship's RCS, made no effort to prepare the 4.5 gun or the Sea Dart missiles, or order chaff to be fired. However, the AWO was called to the operations room by the PWO and arrived just before the first missile hit. Critically, Sheffield did not have any electronic countermeasures jammers fitted. The second Exocet missed and bounced harmlessly into the sea as its launching aircraft flew over Sheffield. The Exocet that would strike Sheffield impacted on the starboard side at Deck 2, travelling through the junior rate scullery and breaching the forward auxiliary machinery room / forward engine room, which was about 2.4 metres above the waterline, creating a hole roughly 1.2 by 3 metres. It appears that the warhead did not explode. Now, accounts suggest that an initial impact of the missile disabled the ship's electronic distribution system and breached the pressurized water system, especially the fire mains, severely hampering any firefighting response and eventually doomed the ship to be consumed by fire. Sheffield and Coventry were chatting over UHF, and communications ceased until an unidentified message was heard flatly saying, "Sheffield is hit." Peter Moyer, a WE on board, is in his off-watch, and he said, as soon as the ship was hit, the ship went to action stations. When the missile hit, the high-pressure saltwater main were severed, spewing water out at 10 bar across the deck, causing a lack of pressure for all firefighting equipment to fight the fires. With the main firefighting system out of action due to loss of the fire main, the crew were reduced to fighting the fire using portable electrically powered pumps and buckets. The control of the firefighting lacked cohesion and was uncoordinated, with no emergency headquarters being established. While fire crews, essentially, or crew members, were unclear as to where the command was located, some reports actually state that the warhead on the Exocet detonated, and given the entry of the weapon, it would have disabled the engines and the diesel generators, leaving the ship without power. Now, with no lighting inside, it would be almost impossible to vent the smoke out of the ship. Granted, tons of it was coming out the side, but still, there was a lot of smoke build-up actually inside the ship. Now, with that, there was a lot of smoke build-up, like I've said, and there was a limited amount of escape routes for people, even with breathing apparatus on. It was apparent that it was going to be near enough impossible to fight the fire. Now, once Arrow and Yarmouth arrived, they assisted in fighting the fire, but with little effect. And such, it was going to be pretty much impossible to save the ship. The fire on Sheffield was fought for almost 4 hours before Captain Salt decided to basically abandon the ship due to the risk of fires igniting the Sea Dart magazine. The exposed position to air attack of Yarmouth and Arrow was also apparent, and basically, Sheffield had no combat capabilities left, and as such, when the crew abandoned the ship, Sub-Lieutenant Carrington Wood led the crew in singing "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life" from Monty Python's Life of Brian. It's the most British thing you'll ever hear. Most of Sheffield's crew climbed over onto Arrow. A few transferred by Gemini Rib to the Yarmouth, and some were taken by helicopter to Hermes. Of the 281 crew members, 20, mainly on duty at the galley and computer room, would die as a result of the attack, with another 26 of the crew injured, mostly from burns, smoke inhalation, and shock. Only one body was actually recovered. The wreck is a war grave and designated by the Protected Place under the protection of the Military Remains Act 1986. The survivors were taken to Ascension Island on the tanker British Esk. Now, Peter Moyer, who was the WE I was speaking about earlier on, is the grandfather of one of the subscribers on the channel. Now, through his grandson, he said to me that he thought at first they had been strafed and they didn't really know what was going on until they came over the tannoy telling them to abandon the ship. Over the 6 days from May the 4th, as the ship drifted, 5 inspections were made to see if any equipment was worth salvaging. Orders were issued to shore up the holes in Sheffield's starboard side and tow the ship to South Georgia. Before these orders, however, were effected, the burnt-out hulk was already being taken under tow by the Rothesay-class frigate HMS Yarmouth. The heavy seas that the ship was towed through caused slow flooding through the hull inside the ship, causing a list to starboard and eventually caused Sheffield to roll over and sink on the edge of the total exclusion zone in 1,000 fathoms of water. Sheffield would go down on the 10th of May, and she would be the first Royal Navy vessel sunk in action since the end of World War II. In response to the loss of the ship, a Ministry of Defence Board of Inquiry was convened at HMS Nelson on the 7th of June 1982. The board report severely criticised the ship's firefighting equipment, training and procedures, identifying that the crucial factors leading to loss of Sheffield were 1. Failure to respond to HMS Glasgow's detection and communication of 2 approaching superintendards by immediately going to action stations, activating the sea dart and launching chaff decoys. 2. Lack of ECM jamming capability. 3. Lack of point defense systems. 4. Inadequate operator training, in particular simulated realistic low-level target acquisition. 5. Slow response of the available Type 909 Sea Dart tracking radar, and its operator limited the possible response. And finally, number 6. The spread of the fire was not adequately controlled due to the presence of ignitable material coverings, as well as the lack of adequate curtains and sealing to restrict smoke and fire, as well as the shortage of breathing apparatus, while the forward escape manholes were found to be too small for men wearing breathing apparatus. Now, Captain Salt's handling of the ship following the impact of the missile and his later decision to abandon the ship was not faulted. The board, however, found the PWO and AWO were guilty of negligence. Now, Admiral John Fieldhouse, the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, decided not to court-martial them, undertake any disciplinary action of any form, or formal administrative proceedings. It wasn't until 2006, following an extensive campaign by ex-Royal Navy personnel, that a heavily censored summary of the board's findings concealed all the board's key conclusions and criticisms, including the findings of negligence, was released by the MOD under the UK Freedom of Information laws. In 2017, a complete copy of the report was issued, revealing information that, according to The Guardian, had been suppressed from the summary of the board's findings in 2006. The Guardian explained the missing information by the British government's attempts to sell the Type 42s at the same time. In the uncensored report, multiple issues were left and the ship's unprepared for the attack was identified, including findings of negligence of 2 officers who, according to The Guardian's, escaped court-martial and did not face disciplinary action, apparently in order to avoid them undermining the euphoria that gripped much of the UK at the end of the war. Among other findings, the uncensored report showed the ship was not significantly prepared to ward off an attack. During the attack, the anti-air warfare officer was not in the ops room, and his assistant had gone to the heads. The anti-air warfare officer did not expect Sheffield to be in range of attack. Sheffield wasn't the only ship to be lost in the war, especially to the threat of anti-ship missiles. And one last thing I need to do before we wrap this video up is